pieces and, of course, the bigger pieces as well.
Perhaps we start at the beginning then with Howells. That question of who is Herbert Howells today for you, I think, would be a good place to start, and maybe talk a little bit about going to the college initially, but how it's morphed into, and your experience obviously at Gloucester.
Sure.
And also I would add to that things like you recorded all the organ works and things like that. So there's some, that's interesting as well, because a lot of people have the RCM connection or one of the direct connections through the cathedral, but you've plugged in a lot of gaps and the Kings and then so he's kind of always been there.
He has. Are we on?
I think you've got it. Yeah. Yes.
Okay. I feel it as though it's a really big part of my life that I've been involved with Howells and his music for a large part of my life. And the first thing that I remember, just excuse a little bit of autobiography, is as a probationer at Worcester Cathedral, not even singing in the choir, but as a probationer, witnessing a performance of Howells' evening service for King's College, Cambridge, accompanied no less by Stephen Cleobury, when the wind system of the organ failed. And the only way that Stephen got through the Magnificat was by having to repeat all the chords. And it sounded so bizarre. I thought, what on earth have I come to here as an 8-year-old, you see? But actually, Stephen was genius. He maintained the performance. And of course, the absolutely seminal thing about the Collegium Regale, particularly the Magnificat, is a sostenuto. But my first experience of it was being played like this. And I just wonder if there's anybody else still alive that actually remembers that occasion. I might ask my brother about it, because I was thinking about it the other day. So I was very aware of Howells when I was a chorister, but perhaps even before that. My father loved everything to do with Howells. He was a church organist, a very clever man, and he had nothing else to add to Howells except that he loved everything, not just the church music, but the orchestral music and everything else as well. And he played all the organ pieces too. So I belong, a large part of my life has been to do with Howells, singing as a chorister. Then I was excited at the time, but it's only in the last few years that I've realized what a privilege it was to actually be taught by him. And again, the number of people alive that are actually taught by him diminishes each year, I would think. And I didn't know him as well as one or two of our colleagues, like Paul Spicer. But I certainly learned quite a lot from him and had the benefit of his wisdom in non-musical matters as well. And some of his reflections and stories about Stamford and VW and all that kind of thing. So I did have a lot of time with him at the RCM. And one of my now treasured mementos is, of course, a report at the end of my second year, because I left after 2 years of the RCM, because I kind of felt I needed to be stretched more. And I went to King's Cambridge, as you know, and Howells had a very strong connection with that college. And in due course, perhaps talk about the Requiem, which I believe was written for the choir at King's College, Cambridge originally. And he wrote me this very nice report, and I've kept it. I ought to frame it, really, but I haven't got around to that yet. And then, subsequently, my career as a cathedral musician and beyond, I've done a large number of Howells works, not just the cathedral stuff, but orchestral stuff, the BBC orchestra, organ stuff, of course, secular stuff, accompanied songs. So I wouldn't in any way claim to be a specialist, but I can at least claim that I've been involved in Howells' work for nearly 60 years.
When you went to King's, where did the Howells repertoire sit in the kind of wider context there? Because I'm just thinking specifically of people I've spoken to who were around when, for example, Coleridge was first performed, and the kind of shock that the choir had in terms of its difficulty. We tend to think of Colreg as one of the easier settings now, but for them it would that and the G minor Mass of Vaughan Williams were really the peak of their performing technique. By the time you arrived at King's, was that still the case?
No, I would say not. I think the college choir did stuff that was actually much more difficult on a regular basis. For example, Hymn to St. Cecilia by Benjamin Britten. I mean, that's far more difficult. I mean, it was treasured. Doing Colreg in King's Chapel was an event. In the same way, I'm happy to say that doing the Gloucester service is an event here. You can just hear the bell for midday mass going there. But I wouldn't say that it was viewed as being particularly difficult. It was treasured part of the repertoire without being one that was considered terribly stretching. There are, as you know better than me, many settings of the canticles that are far harder than Collegium Regale. We do. I think we may be one of the few cathedrals that does this St. Augustine service. Do you know that? That's very hard indeed. And there are others as well. Some that have disappeared. I mean, I used to enjoy the Worcester service, but I'm not sure if that gets done much these days. I might better ask my counterpart at Worcester, but I don't think they do it there either. But as far as King's is concerned, certainly he was considered core repertoire, but not definitely by then avant-garde or particularly difficult.
Was there anything specific in terms of performance practice that you inherited? So was there a particular King's way of doing it that you were shown?
Yes. Everything was very slow, of course. And speaking from an organist perspective, I inherited certain sounds from the organ scholar's copy. And I think the person who scored, so to speak, registered the piece for use at King's was Francis Greer. You familiar with his name? He went to Christchurch after King's and then went and did other things, became a composer. And I think he was in direct contact with David Wilcox, and of course is the source of so much concerning Howells, because they were pretty close, weren't they? And so that's all I would say, that there was registrations handed down and over the decades. But as far as performing is concerned, I can't say there's anything particularly Kingsian about that piece, except that it just requires in that building, as indeed in this one with a similar acoustic, to be done pretty slowly compared to what other cathedral choirs do.
There are a lot of there's a lot written about Howells writing for very specific places. We've just talked about King's a bit there. Do you feel that there is an attachment with the Gloucester service here?
Very much so. In fact, considering I studied with him nearly 50 years ago, 47 years ago, I specifically asked him some questions about the evening services, because at the time I was the old scholar at St. George's Chapel, Windsor. And I remember finding the Howells in G, the first one, quite tricky. And one of the things that I remember asking him about was, why did he write it in minims? Because there's been this sort of change of, writing in minims was standard in the 18th century, wasn't it? And then by the time it got to the 20th, everybody wrote in crotchets, well, certainly in church music. And I said, why did you write it in minims? And I remember exactly what he said. He said, it's because I thought it made it look more holy. So he thought he was writing church music, so it should be in minims. So that's one thing I clearly remember. I'm not sure whether he was being very serious, by the way, because as you probably remember, he had quite a twinkle in his eye. But anyway, that was his answer. But as far as pieces being appropriate to their buildings, I mean, I think of all of them, the Gloucester service is appropriate for this building, because he'd been what we would now call organ scholar here, article pupil, basically slave to Herbert Brewer. But he just knew this building from a young age. And the other thing that I wanted to say, which is well known, and he must have said it to a lot of people, but those famous, I think they're called strainer arches under the tower, just above the choir stalls, he said that when in the glory it goes, he said that he was thinking of those arches when he wrote that. And so I have that absolutely first-hand from him, said to me in about 1977. And I tell the choristers this, all the generations of choristers, and actually when I'm conducting it, I often look up, and it's just a perfect match of music and architecture. But apart from that, the other thing that's particularly good about these Howells settings for resonant buildings is how the harmony moves slowly. Because in an acoustic like this, which is actually in many ways even more resonant than King's, because the sound goes on longer, anything where it's too busy or the harmony moves too quickly just becomes quite quickly a jumble. And so these chords in the Gloucester service, F sharp major, it goes off half a page at a time, and it's totally appropriate. As indeed are all the individual melodies. It's a very trite thing to say, but they all have a clear beginning, middle, and an end. And so the acoustic shapes the way that the melodies flow, or I shall put it the other way around. The melodies are shaped by the acoustic, his memory of the acoustic. So that nothing ever gets lost, you see. He really knew what he was doing.
How do those sort of concepts come into your organ playing? Because you've recorded the organ music.
Well, not all right.
And actually quite a lot of it is very different. I'm thinking about particularly your fabulous recording of the Partita, which is a work that I've struggled with sometimes. And a few years ago, Stephen Clearbury and I programmed the Partita on consecutive nights in Cambridge, and he played it at King's on Saturday night, and I played it at Trinity on Sunday night.
Okay.
Wow! So it kind of proved that
How on earth did you do that?
this was a piece that could be done in either. But what I loved about playing it in Trinity was that you could hear all of those upbeat accents and all of those kind of Walton-like little rhythmic energies, and particularly the pedal part spoke as it does. I mean, I wonder how you got on with particularly the Partita and those later works when you came to record them.
Well, I knew the organ that I was going to be playing, which is Winchester Cathedral, and I love that building, but it is quite dry compared to the buildings we're talking about. I mean, I think possibly even Trinity has more warmth in it than Winchester. So I hoped when I was preparing it that I wouldn't have to work so hard or absurdly hard at articulation in order to make it clear. Because you always got this contradiction between seeking clarity without breaking the legato, which is such an important part of Howells' organ writing. And that's all I would say, really, that I don't know if I got it right. I mean, I'm not sure if I could play it now. It's hard, that piece, isn't it? Whoa, very hard. It's the hardest of all the Howells pieces. But it was a thrill to do it. But I wouldn't say that my knowledge or expertise is such that I can comment further, except that seeking clarity was what I was trying to do all the time.
I wonder if we can talk about speeds, because that's a big part of this clarity, isn't it? An awful lot of Howells' metronome markings are questioned by performers.
Yeah.
I've been part of a debate recently when I recorded the Paean at 144, and whether this was a good thing or not. The jury's still out. And I think a lot of these pieces work at a range of different tempos. Obviously, with the recordings of the Starbuck March and the Mrs. Avranensis recently, there was a lot of discussion about the way in which Howells changed timings there. With Hymnus Paradisi in particular, do you feel that the metronome markings are representative, or are they a guide, or how do you think?
Well, it's not just the discussion about Howells, is it really? I mean, Elgar as well. They are a guide. And composers have an idea in their head, don't they? Which often doesn't quite work out when it's in real performance. And sometimes composers are the worst interpreters of their own work. Doing a lot of work on Elgar's First Symphony at the moment. And as an example, and the metronome marks are quite crazy, too fast. And I know he's a nervous sort of guy and he wants to get on with stuff and got bored very easily. But his performances, while thrilling, are also quite muddled because they're too fast. And I kind of feel that's a bit about hymnus. They are on the fast side. But funnily enough, the slow ones are right. Crotchet equals 42 is right. But the faster stuff, you cannot do it. I mean, I'm doing this piece in Hereford this year, which is, again, it's a lovely acoustic, but it's not a big one. But nevertheless, you have to take it down a bit because it just gets too muddled. And the other thing, the organ music as well, that's the hymnus and the other stuff, there's a lot of detail in it. Quite a lot, which gets so easily gets lost. Every time I look at that score, which is quite often, every other day, I find stuff I thought that I'd never really noticed before. How am I going to get this clear? Is it necessary for it to be clear? I wonder if some of it's a bit over fussy. That the scoring often reminds me a bit of organ music, in the sense that it's quite thick when it's loud. There's a lot of it which is like a psalm prelude, crescendo, forte, diminuendo, and you could say that about any composer, I suppose. But I wonder if sometimes it's a little overwritten, if that makes sense. Particularly in view of the fact, which needs to be mentioned, that in the 1950s, and indeed with ours of Chorister, the three choirs chorus was sort of 300 strong. And now, not because of lack of interest or lack of application or anything like that, we're dealing with a choir that's only half that size. And so a lot of the choral detail, you have to work terribly hard with an orchestra to make it work. One of the things I most remember about Herbert Howells, and everybody who has said this to you, was how immaculately he was always dressed. I mean, everything. Tie carefully folded, tie with a, what do they call, the Windsor knot and all that sort of thing. And he was meticulous, and his handwriting was very slow and precise. And I sometimes feel that this is part of his personality here on this subject, that it's very, if I was being unkind, I'd say it's fussy. I mean, absolutely everything that he could fit in, he fits in. And sometimes the music could benefit by just being a little simpler. I mean, Elgar's fussy as well, but if you look at the score of his, there's more rests than notes. And Howells, there's more notes than rests in the tutti passages. So it's just an observation, but in no way is that a criticism. I just want to say that that's how I feel when I look at the score and work with the piece.
I think I would have agreed with you 10 years ago. And the thing that has really changed my opinion recently is being involved with a lot of very good recordings that have been done by really excellent sound engineers.
Yeah.
And what has happened, I think, particularly working on that double disc from King's Cambridge with Simon Kiln, he was able.
Oh, he's excellent.
He was able to produce this mix with a lot of microphones and a lot of experience in that chapel and excellent technology, of course. And whilst we had rehearsals in the chapel that were thrilling, and you would have come up with all the sorts of questions that we're talking about here, when you then got into the booth and you put on your headphones, it was almost like you'd been given glasses for the first time. Everything came into focus. And looking at the full score in front of me, I thought, I can hear those harp harmonics. I can hear those muted horns. I can hear all of the fussiness that we're talking about. And I wonder whether, in a way, this is Herbert Howells's time, precisely because of the quality of recording technology, which sort of means that we see these kind of two parallel roads of Howell's performance. What is possible in a studio,
Yes.
which of course you've got a lot of experience of,
Yeah.
and what is possible in the cathedral, in the live performance. Does that bother you?
No, not really. But it was written for live performance, not for recording. And although, it's possible to create a perfect world in a recording studio, right? It never is in a live performance. So of course, there's two ways of looking at it. I feel that with the Vernon Handley recording that I was telling you, it is fantastic. It is so clear. As I said before, the choir sounds quite small. The balance is always fine. So there's things you can do in the recording to enhance the music that may make a piece slightly better than actually the composer left it. Because if a composer, if he's writing or she's writing for a specific set of circumstances, then, there's always going to be problems. Banging doors, children crying, brass bored and won't shut up, sopranos tired and flat. There's always problems with live performance, which some composers are very aware of, but some composers are not totally aware of what is possible and what is practical. Now, I think Howells was aware, but what I'm saying is the circumstances have changed. But I think orchestras are louder now than they were in the 1950s, one thing. I think choirs are smaller. And I think also that health and safety and various other things that we restrict us these days, I think the concerts, three choirs concerts in the 1950s were absolutely packed. And if you put 1,000 people in Gloucester Cathedral, it really dampens the acoustic. I hope we might get 1,000 in Hereford Hymnus Paradisi. It's selling extremely well, which I'm absolutely delighted about. We're up to 800 already. But it does make a big difference. And if there was a lot more in the 1950s than there is now, all these things contribute to a success or otherwise of a performance. Whereas you don't have to consider any of that in the recording studio. You can just do what you want. And this doesn't apply to Howells, of course. It applies to everybody, everybody's work.
I wonder if we can address this year's performance and the Hymnus Paradisi and of course Paradise Rondell. You're the artistic director for the Gloucester festival, but you're involved with Hereford as well. Why have you chosen Howells this year?
Can I give you the honest answer, which may not be the most diplomatic one? It was nothing to do with me whatsoever. It's that the home artistic director of the three choirs has pretty much 100% control over what is programmed. And my dear friend and counterpart, Gerard Bowen, has produced this wonderful program for Hereford this year. And I was delighted and thrilled to be asked to conduct this Howells and Bliss concert. And so we have Gerard entirely to thank for this. He is the artistic director. He chose the program. I did not know the wonderful Bliss piece. Do you know it's Mary of Magdala? Richard? No. You see, it's a half-an-hour cantata, which has been an absolute eye-opener for me. And I certainly didn't know the Paradise Rondell either. So Gerard put the program together, and then we talk about the soloists and how many strings we should have and all that sort of thing. But his is the conception, mine is the detail, and it's seeing the project through.
And what do you think your conception of Hymnus Paradisi is then?
Ah, well, this is interesting because when I first got to know it, in my 20s probably, it sounded to me like 6 different pieces that had just been put together. I mean, I know that there's the links, there's the sort of Brontius-like theme at the beginning that comes into the end and 1 or 2 places in between, but it just seemed like 6 separate pieces. But as I've got older, I've become more and more aware of how actually it is a wonderfully organic piece. And it doesn't feel to me anymore like 6 separate pieces. It feels like a welded whole that has 6 parts to it. But a particularly knowledge of where some of the music came from has helped me feel this. Because the movements that he pinched from his early and unpublished Requiem, which is now published, of course, he has metamorphosed them, if that verb exists, in such a clever way as to make it feel those movements, which were pre-composed, made them feel much more part of the overall flow of the piece. I mean, The Lord is My Shepherd, the transformation of the original unaccompanied movement from the Requiem to how it appears in Hymnus Paradisi. I think it's genius. Absolutely. Devout. It's the way he takes the tunes from the Requiem and dresses them up, changes them where necessary, adds orchestra, adds interludes, and just expands and colors the whole thing so that it fits the mood and the theme of the larger work. I think is one of the most convincing things about the piece, as far as I'm concerned. So when I lay down my baton at the end, I feel like a whole life cycle has been concluded from the opening. And I find it much more satisfying to listen to and indeed to conduct than I did 30 years ago, when I couldn't perceive the connection and the process behind it.
That's very interesting because for a while I felt you open up a lot of writing on Howells, and Hymnus is held as the masterpiece. And I felt like I was the only Howells skeptic here. And I said to Paul Spicer early on, I don't get Hymnus. And I said, I feel like it's 6 pieces. So
We've had the same
journey. And I think I've come to it recently, I think partly having been asked to talk about it at the Three Choirs Festival. I've started again. I think this happened when I was asked to talk about the Tallis Fantasia. If you feel you know a piece, but then when you actually have to sit down and write about it and spend a lot of time with it and think about what does it actually mean, your views change quite rapidly. And what I'm particularly interested in is the way in which the relationship between the Requiem and Hymnus. How do you feel the pieces differ? Obviously, I have very specific views, I think, now. But I'd be very interested to hear your views on that.
Well, underneath, they're very similar. They both are so indicative of the Howells that I know, in the sense, there's 2 words that come to me straight away. There's melancholy and there's sensuality. And although the Requiem is austere in the sense that it's for a cappella choir and it's quite sort of spare in it, so it's not that chromatic and it's quite modal, there is still this underlying feeling of those 2 qualities, which are reproduced in bundles in Hymnus Paradisi, because obviously a lot had happened in his life between the composing of one and composing the other. But I think the way he wrote was already there. I think that the musician, I should say, had developed from the one to the other. although there were not that many years between them, were there? The Requiem is what, early 1930s?
Yes.
And Hymnus took quite a long time to write, but it was basically late 1930s.
Yes.
And it is said that he put it away, for the war years and all that sort of thing, and then took it out afterwards. So what I'm not clear about, and you probably are as an academic, is how much Howells actually added or developed in the late 1940s. What did he do to the score? I just don't know. But certainly for me, the basics are the same, but they're just developed and more sophisticated. And there's a more of an emphasis in Hymnus Paradisi, the later work, on sensuality, melodic sensuality. Obvious, everybody's mentioned this, but the flattened sevenths, the sharpened fourths, all the quite shocking key changes. You think, what's that about? And then you suddenly realize that is the end of a logical process. It's extraordinary. I'm not quite sure how it works, but you can be in any key you want, and then suddenly he'll home in, because of the logical movement of the parts, he'll home on the key, which seems not to be anything to do with what's preceded it, but actually is. And that's one of the best things about this piece, and Howells in general. So melody, harmony, and then orchestration. Both of us, we could write a book about this. But there's certain colors in Hymnus which are just apposite. And the number one thing came into my mind when I was saying that was the cor anglais. Elgar, who I keep mentioning, because I have the manuscript behind me on the wall up there. It's my prized possession. Also knew when he wrote a tune what was going to be playing it, and I think pretty much Howells knew too. The colours are so appropriate. The clarinet solo at the end of the Psalters. What else could do it? Nothing. Viola, quite often, little viola solos here and there, wouldn't work with anything else. So that is definitely an advance, obviously, because it's orchestra, and the earlier piece didn't have orchestra, but his feeling for appropriate colour became much more sophisticated through those years that we were talking about.
It's interesting. He plays down that period, really, because he kind of emphasizes it's really written in the late 30s, and then he's persuaded to unearth it, as he says, by a group of people, mainly Assumption, who was so close to him at this point, and was as the one who dragged him out of Twigworth physically when he refused to leave the church after several weeks after the funeral of Michael. And in a way, it's interesting that Assumption suggested the title, as we've mentioned, this idea of the hymn of paradise. And I wonder whether we could just talk about for a second whether the relationship between the Requiem and Hymnus actually changes the meaning in any way. Because this idea of paradise is quite a difficult one.
Yeah.
It's something different to different people. I have ideas about what paradise means for Howells and for me, and I think for everybody, it's a difference. But it's a big part of belief, and I wonder what you think, particularly since we're doing two pieces here, Paradise Rondel and Hymnus Paradisi, what you think that word means, and whether the way in which the Requiem morphed into Hymnus Paradisi says something about that.
That's a big question. I think the word paradise reference those two pieces means two different things. The Paradise Rondel, it's simply paradise. There is something like a wonderful garden, which you can go to for good behavior. Because it's a lovely piece, but it's quite, what's the word? Compared to Hymnus Paradisi, emotionally, it's unsophisticated. It's just like a summer breeze. I mean, there's some slow passages, some lovely solo stuff. There's recurring themes and all that. But it's just like a lovely garden full of happy things. Whereas Hymnus Paradisi, the word paradise there, to me, represents Howells' hope. And his hope, whether it was ever articulated, was that one day he would see Michael again. And the contrast between the end of the hymnus and the end of the requiem is precisely that after all the trauma and all the prayers and all everything else, everything is going to be okay. And Herbert and Michael are going to be united in this wonderful feeling of ecstasy, which only they can share. And it's that thought that makes, for me, the finale of this piece so exciting. I mean, the big allegro in the middle it is ecstatic, isn't it? There's no other word for it. And I must remember not to take it too quickly, because if you do take it too quickly, it becomes over the top. But just to control it a bit is the way to get the most out of it. So that's what I think paradise means there. It is a philosophical notion that, not even sure if it's a belief. It's a hope, and to do with Michael's death. And what I think about paradise, I think, is not really relevant in this conversation.
It's interesting. I think in my mind, it's related to what Lewis Borman's called all of these agnostics of prayer.
Oh, yeah.
But it's also linked in with Hubert Parry and the way in which he produces very specific sound of ecstatic sound. So the anthems that Howells keeps coming back to, Blessed Pair, and I Was Glad. Of course, Blessed Pair is Milton, and for Howells, Paradise Lost was a very important book.
Okay.
He could quote big chunks of it. The poetry of Milton was actually the topic of his first prize-winning essay.
Oh, really?
At the RCM. So he did have I think he probably had quite a literary sense of Paradise.
About which I know very little, I'm sorry to say. I'm not an academic. I remember being made to read one part of Paradise Lost at school and finding it very difficult, and I haven't yet gone back to it. But maybe I should.
But I think I'm also interested in the way that the Requiem, when it morphs into Hymnus Paradisi, drops all of that initial stuff about the cross and redemption and some quite core Christian ideas.
Yes.
And morphs into something which is spiritually and theologically very different in Hymnus. So it's not just the texts that he introduces, it's the ones that he drops. I think tells us something about the loss of Michael.
There's no Agnus Dei, or no, and even the Sanctus is qualified by the psalm with which it is linked. So no, I completely get that. It hadn't occurred to me, I have to be honest with you. But
we also get this constant play between heaven and earth, don't we? And I think that's one of the themes that he deals with best, and because actually a lot of pieces have separation, and in terms of which soloists are given things and choruses, and we think about it a lot in relation to the Britain War Requiem, don't we? The separation of who's doing what with these kind of texts that involve different texts and their relationships. But I think with Hymnus, it's particularly interesting that he's constantly trying to give us this sense of heaven and earth,
yes,
and the kind of almost the coming together, which you get kind of spiritually, which I think is really interesting. I think Howells is a concept of paradise very much on earth.
Yes, although I've often thought that the Dream of Gronges is in the mix somewhere. because the beginning is pretty much identical, isn't it? The beginning of the two pieces, even the same scoring, clarinet, bassoon, and viola. So, as well as being a gesture to those that know, and his audience here, of course, have known Dream Frontiers backwards, I wondered if there was something more to it than that. And what you said struck a chord with you, because I've always thought that here we have the people on earth and the people in heaven. In the same way that we have in Grontius, part one, we have the mourners, and then Grontius goes off on his journey. And we are the people that pray in the Psalms are on the earth, and the soul of Michael is beyond. So it's the same kind of thing, same kind of idea, and then there must be a reason why he almost quotes from Grontius at the beginning and finishes with it as well. So it is, as you say, something to do with the connection between earth and heaven.
Yes, and taking a text from the burial service as well.
Yeah.
That kind of the physical connection,
Yeah.
that inability to leave Twigworth, the connection with Gloucester.
Yeah.
I think that all points to that.
Definitely.
I also am quite struck every time I've listened recently, and I wonder whether this is something that occurs to you, that we have in the male and female soloists, effectively we have the parent figures. So we have almost Howells and his wife as part of that ritual process.
Yes, that's a good idea. But am I right in thinking?
In a way that we don't have in the Requiem. No, not the way he sword it to the soloists. It's quite a different soundic.
Isn't Howells's daughter more of a seminal influence in Hymnus Paradisi than his wife? Wasn't it she that encouraged him to pour out his grief, or at least help him to control his grief by committing what he was feeling to paper? So I just wonder if, using that image, we're talking about Howells and his daughter rather than Howells and his wife. Just a thought.
Yeah.
Because she was an important person in his life. Very important. Well, as indeed as his work, but she was a very important person. And we should all be grateful to her. She became an actress, didn't she?
She did. And Michael is present in a way. He wrote a note.
What did it say? I've never known that.
Oh, no, I did. And he wrote an actual note in the...
I see.
Got him to write.
It's a note. It's I've always misunderstood that. I thought he wrote something, maybe childlike but wise.
No, it's a single musical note.
It was a good, that is.
So his presence is there.
Okay. That's rather moving, isn't it? I didn't know. Do you know which one it was?
I did. I'm going to have to look that one up.
I have scored.
So I'll send you an email, and I'll just notes like this. But it's that presence and the way in which the kind of ritual is you could hear it, I think, is really interesting. Particularly when we have the psalmody, the way in which I wonder whether he was really influenced a lot of the time by what he heard initially at Westminster Cathedral.
Well,
and the way in which actually we tend to concentrate on the Anglican Church, but actually that initial hearing of chant,
yes,
and the way in which the melismas play out.
Yes.
And
the Nogdomitis, the Latin Nogdomitis, yeah.
And then the way in which they're accompanied occasionally, sometimes and he heard that at Westminster Cathedral as well, and often in quite essential way.
Yes.
So I wonder whether what we're really hearing here is the outcome of that initial Catholic training.
Yes. I don't know enough about it to comment, but I think it seems highly likely. I was aware of the Westminster Cathedral connection because in the cathedral we do the Howells Hymnus Paradisi once or twice a year. Very beautiful, isn't it? I mean, the Holst setting, for the same purpose, Westminster Cathedral is much more famous, but the Howells one is probably more to my taste. Beautiful.
I wonder whether we can finish with another specific question about performance, and that's the role in which kind of ritual dances come into Howells. And what I've been interested in a lot recently is looking at the Stabat Mater, as he called it, a series of sarabands. and the way in which you can actually approach a lot of Howells' repertoire in quite a strict way. So, for example, the saraband in the partita, I recorded with a metronome, and actually decided to take a much more kind of stylized and strict rhythmic approach. Of course, there's also an awful lot of Howells' music which, like Elgar, requires a lot of rubato. And so I think in a way, hymnus, I hear it as something that switches between some very strict passage work and some very flexible passage work. And is that something that you've considered?
That's what you might approach, definitely. And I'd referred to it before, and I'll refer to it again, but I think Vernon Handley gets this absolutely right. That sometimes because as a conductor, he taught me, that's why I'm a fan of his. As a conductor, he was inclined to underplay everything and to allow, in his view, the music to speak for itself. And I think this is the same Requiem and Hymnus Paradisi, and also the organ music. That the more wallowing around you do, it just seems like self-indulgence. And I think that's the case. So let's take the Preludio, for example. The wonderful climax in the middle of this short piece. If you move it around too much, you get too slow. If you just do your own allargandos, it completely falls to pieces. It just becomes a noise. And it's interesting, I believe that Howells felt this himself, because he only puts allargando, I think, once in that movement. But you'd think from other recordings and other performances that they're in every other bar. He's very careful. After the tiny allargando at the top of the climax, it is tempo. And it moves seamlessly down this diminuendo from 4/4 to 7/8 and so on. So I agree that an underlying pulse is necessary in order to make the music speak properly. And it's the same in Elgar, really. The people that do too much to it weaken it. So you will hear a slightly more restrained and classical performance of it in Hereford for that reason. I mean, there are times when you can be expansive, like at cadences. I mean, I'm not going to do it in time all the way through to the last bar, but I think underneath there's got to be a sure feeling of pulse. I'm thinking of underneath. Have you noticed, I'm sure you have, in the allegro movements, how in these quasi-pedal passages, how syncopated the double basses and timpani often are? It's very exciting, isn't it? You see, a lot of composers wouldn't bother. I'm not even sure if Elgar would have done that. But the offbeat, irregular beat, it propels it in the most interesting and effective way. So, yes, your words certainly apply to the way I view it. There are times when you can let your imagination run, but underneath, it's got to be like that. Regular. Not too indulgent.
Excellent. Well, I think that's covered an awful lot of
Well, thank you.
detail, and
I think I've learned a lot more from you than you have from me.
what? Thank you. Well, I think it's the process of being